Gilda Radner made America laugh, but behind that smile was a story her husband carried for decades. She grew up in comfort, became a star on Saturday Night Live, and married Gene Wilder in what looked like a perfect love story. But after her death, Gene finally admitted the truth was far darker: missed warnings, months of wrong answers, guilt over how their romance began, and hospital nights that changed him forever. Why did doctors keep telling Gilda it was just stress when something far worse was growing inside her? And what did Gene reveal years later that still feels hard to believe? Gilda Radner's early life looked beautiful from a distance. Born June 28, 1946, in Detroit, she grew up the only daughter in a wealthy Jewish family, her father Herman owning a hotel on Woodward Avenue, the family living in one of the city's most upscale neighborhoods. But money couldn't give her the steady emotional safety she needed, and years later she'd still describe her childhood as one of the hardest stretches of her life. Herman became her first audience, taking her to live shows downtown and sometimes to Broadway during work trips. At home she did voices and little sketches at the dinner table, and he encouraged every bit of it, teaching her early that laughter could bring attention and warmth. By 10, the pattern was set: when her father watched, she performed, and his laughter became tied to her sense of worth. Then everything changed. In 1960, when Gilda was 14, her father developed a brain tumor. She watched the man who'd once been full of life lose his speech, his energy, and pieces of who he was. He died that same year, and the loss stayed with her, not just grief but the memory of helplessness, the fear of being trapped inside a body that no longer obeyed you. Decades later, facing ovarian cancer herself, she'd connect that old fear back to watching her father disappear. Even before that loss, another struggle had already taken hold. At school she was mocked for her weight, and the shame settled in early, teaching her to make the joke before anyone else could. At 10, instead of easing the pressure around food and image, the adults around her put her on diet pills, pushing her into a long, damaging relationship with food. She later said she developed nearly every eating disorder imaginable starting around age 9, and as an adult she was even hospitalized for bulimia. Her governess, a woman named Dibby, gave her advice that shaped her comedy forever: when kids teased her, say it first, laugh before they do. That instinct, staying one step ahead of hurt, became the seed of the fearless self-mockery that later made audiences love her. Her childhood never settled into a normal rhythm either. Her mother disliked Detroit winters so much she'd take Gilda to Florida for months at a stretch, sometimes causing her to miss up to 4 months of school. She never moved through a full year with the same classmates, friendships were hard to build, and she learned to win people over fast because staying connected never felt guaranteed, a skill that later powered her live energy on stage. By the time she graduated high school in 1964, that mix of humor, insecurity, and hunger for connection was fully set. She headed to the University of Michigan planning to become a teacher for developmentally challenged children, a practical, generous path. But once in Ann Arbor, acting and improv classes started pulling her in a different direction, rehearsals and sketch workshops filling more of her time, and professors began noticing a rare instinct for performance. By 1969, roughly one semester from graduating, she made the choice that changed everything. She left without the diploma, partly to follow a boyfriend to Toronto, but also because the city's theater world offered something classrooms couldn't. At 23, she walked into an uncertain future, starting out as a clown at children's events for about $60 a week. In May 1972, she landed in the Toronto production of Godspell, alongside a cast that would later look astonishing: Martin Short, Eugene Levy, Andrea Martin, Victor Garber, Dave Thomas, and Paul Schaefer. Around 1973 she joined Second City's Toronto company, working alongside future stars like Dan Aykroyd and John Candy, learning to build characters live, commit fully, and recover fast when a bit fell flat. By 1974 she'd moved to New York, joining the National Lampoon Radio Hour at 28 alongside Bill Murray, Chevy Chase, John Belushi, and others, sharpening the frantic, anxious, talk-too-much characters that would define her best-known work. That's how Lorne Michaels found her, hearing her on Lampoon tapes while building a new late-night sketch show for NBC. She became the first performer officially hired for what would become Saturday Night Live. When it premiered October 11, 1975, 29-year-old Gilda stood beside Belushi, Aykroyd, Chevy Chase, Jane Curtin, Lorraine Newman, and Garrett Morris as part of the original cast, and within weeks critics were already singling her out. She brought something no one else on the show did: warmth and fragility mixed with total chaos, feeling human even at her most absurd. Between 1975 and 1980 she created recurring characters that became the show's backbone: Emily Lit Ella, Roseanne Rosianna Dana, Baba Wawa, Lisa Lupner, each pulling from a different piece of her own life. Emily Lit Ella grew out of her love for Dibby. Roseanne Rosianna Dana turned every gross detail into comedy gold. Lisa Lupner carried the awkwardness and insecurity of Gilda's own painful past. In 1978 she won an Emmy for it. In October 1979, she opened her own Broadway show, Gilda Radner Live from New York, carrying an entire evening by herself, later turned into the concert film Gilda Live, directed by Mike Nichols. She left SNL in May 1980 after 5 seasons and over 100 episodes, and while it looked like a natural move toward film, the pressures of fame hadn't quieted the eating struggles that had started in childhood, and she later wrote openly about severe weight swings, crash diets, and bulimia. Movies didn't hand her the same spotlight television had. She appeared in First Family in 1980, then Hanky Panky in 1982, where she met Gene Wilder, and later The Woman in Red in 1984, again opposite Wilder. Her personal life shifted too. She married SNL guitarist G.E. Smith on March 26, 1980, but the marriage moved fast and ended fast, over by 1982 under the strain of schedules and pressure. When Gilda met Gene Wilder on the set of Hanky Panky, both were already married, Gilda to G.E. Smith, Gene on his third marriage after 2 divorces. On paper it should have been guarded and complicated. Instead, something about the connection felt bigger than the moment. On one of their first nights filming near the Hudson River in 1982, Gilda suddenly started crying and told Gene, almost like she'd seen the ending before the beginning, "I know I'm going to marry you." Nothing had happened yet, no affair, just the feeling arriving early and undeniably. Gilda later wrote that the first time she saw him her heart fluttered and she felt completely hooked, joking that she practically chased him down. Gene confirmed the story more than once, remembering that bold prediction and admitting her intensity could overwhelm him, that he sometimes saw her as fragile, almost childlike in how badly she needed closeness. Even so, he said, they didn't always get along, but they loved each other, a line that captures the whole shape of what they were. The bond grew into dangerous territory fast. Their romance became an affair in 1982, while Gilda's marriage to G.E. Smith was already falling apart. She told Gene she was unhappy at home, then filed for divorce. By the time filming wrapped, they were emotionally entangled and already talking about a future together. After her divorce they moved in together. But the way it began never fully left her in peace. She later admitted that starting their love story through an affair stayed with her, and when her health began to fail years later, she wondered quietly whether fate was punishing her for it, a thought that reveals just how deeply she felt things, never fully free of the fear that joy might come with a price. For a while, though, happiness really did arrive. Gene and Gilda lived together roughly 2 years before marrying in September 1984, in a small town in the south of France, an intimate, almost spontaneous ceremony with Gilda's Yorkshire Terrier there for the day. Gene later said the decision clicked into place suddenly. On a solo trip to France, he simply realized he should marry her. They bought an 18th-century house in Connecticut, wanted a child, and filled their days with tennis, private jokes, and the small rituals couples build without noticing. Gilda told People that being with Gene felt like moving from black and white into Technicolor. Their love spilled onto the screen too, 3 films together between 1982 and 1986, Hanky Panky, The Woman in Red, and Haunted Honeymoon, the real chemistry bleeding into every scene. Haunted Honeymoon, filmed in 1985 and 1986, cast them as a couple facing strange dangers just before their wedding, a plot that feels haunting in hindsight, because by then a real medical crisis was already moving quietly toward them. In November 1985, while filming Haunted Honeymoon in London, Gilda started feeling something wrong in her body, intense pain in both thighs, crushing tiredness, a sense of illness she couldn't shake. People assumed it was stress or exhaustion from the set. But this felt different to her, and what she was actually feeling were the earliest signs of ovarian cancer. What followed were months of frustration and dismissal. From late 1985 through much of 1986, she went from doctor to doctor, internists, gynecologists, even psychiatrists, telling them again and again that something was deeply wrong, that the pain and bloating and exhaustion kept getting worse. Instead of fast, thorough testing, she was told it was stress, or anxiety, or vague women's health issues, handed reassurance and tranquilizers when she needed someone to look harder. By the time a full workup finally happened in 1986, the cancer had already spread beyond her ovaries, and the window for a much better outcome had already closed. In October 1986, she went into major surgery still hoping the disease might be contained. What surgeons found instead was devastating. Cancer had spread to her liver and bowels, stage 4, the most advanced stage, with a grape-sized tumor in her abdomen and smaller deposits scattered throughout. She was only 40 years old, and she woke up facing multiple losses at once. The hysterectomy meant her fertility was gone forever, and the diagnosis meant the odds had become frighteningly small. What followed was years of surgery, chemotherapy, and roughly 30 radiation treatments, along with strict diets and yoga, trying to hold on to some sense of control her doctors hadn't given her early enough. Her weight dropped to around 93 pounds. In 1988 she was told she was in remission, and for a little while that word changed everything, suggesting relief, a second chance. Then within 3 months the cancer returned, and Hope had to fight for space all over again. Running underneath all of it was the quiet grief of losing motherhood. She and Jean had tried to have a child almost right after their 1984 wedding. She suffered at least one ectopic pregnancy she called devastating, along with miscarriages, and doctors eventually told her she was effectively infertile even before the surgery made it permanent in October 1986. Alongside the public story of a beloved comedian fighting cancer sat a quieter, private sorrow inside the marriage, grief for a child they would never have. In the late 1980s, between chemo sessions and hospital stays, Gilda began writing her memoir, It's Always Something. It came out in 1989, only weeks before she died, and in it she did something brave, describing the raw physical reality most public figures hide, vomiting into buckets, losing her hair, watching her body shrink. She recorded the audiobook herself in early 1989, about a month before her final hospitalization, giving people her actual voice, still warm, still reaching out, even as her strength faded. Around 1987 she started appearing on major television shows talking plainly about what had happened to her, the 10 months of misdiagnosis, being told it was probably stress or something vague and manageable, the humiliating side effects nobody talks about, hair coming out in clumps, steroids changing her face, early menopause. By saying the word ovarian again and again in public, she pulled the disease into ordinary American living rooms in a way that had rarely happened before, and that alone changed something important. Her final days came fast. On May 17, 1989, she was admitted to Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles for treatment side effects. 2 days later, after severe abdominal pain, she was sedated for a CT scan, slipped into a coma, and never woke up. At 6:20 in the morning on May 20, 1989, Gilda Radner died in her sleep at 42, with Jean Wilder by her bedside. The official cause ovarian carcinoma with metastases to the liver and bowel. Jean didn't simply move past the loss. He carried it, and then he turned it outward. He began speaking publicly about the failures that helped lead to her death, saying clearly it didn't have to happen this way, pointing not just at his own missed warnings but at doctors who never looked deeply enough at her symptoms or family history. In the early 1990s that grief became purpose, helping launch the Gilda Radner Familial Ovarian Cancer Registry at Roswell Park, gathering family histories and DNA to help future women get diagnosed in time, a direct answer to the question her death had left behind. He couldn't save Gilda, but maybe he could help save someone else. In later interviews and in his 2005 memoir, Kiss Me Like a Stranger, Jean stripped away any illusion that theirs had been a flawless fairy tale, admitting the relationship began under painful circumstances, that Gilda carried real guilt over the affair, and that illness brought its own strain of endless appointments and emotional exhaustion. That honesty didn't weaken their story, it gave it shape. As her illness worsened, she was terrified of being alone in the hospital, wanting Gene close after chemo and surgery had left her weak, bald, and under 100 pounds. He stayed by her bedside through long hours of machines and waiting, furious at how easily her suffering had once been explained away, grief already beginning even before she was gone, a helpless rage that would later become the fuel behind everything he built in her memory.